Senator Tim Scott makes shocking admission about Trump, liberals are stunned. South Carolina Republican Senator Tim Scott just made a shocking admission about a private moment that he had with President Donald Trump in the Oval Office. Liberals are stunned by what he had to say, which was captured on video. Even before President Donald Trump took office, liberals have gone out of their way to paint him as a racist and a bigot. Everyone from Democrats to the mainstream media has continually tried to portray our president as a closed-minded buffoon and as someone who is insensitive to the rocky history of race relations in our country. However, after they see a CNN interview with Senator Scott, RSC, they won't have a leg to stand on. According to Daily Caller, during the interview with CNN host Alisyn Camerota, Scott shared the set with Congressman Trey Gowdy, RSC, and relayed a very specific encounter that he had with President Donald Trump. Liberals weren't ready to hear about this. I tell you the truth, I go back to a specific incident in the Charlottesville situation, where I had some very harsh comments about the president. And, I was very candid about my displeasure and how I found some of his comments to be indefensible. He invited me into the Oval Office after my criticism, and I found something quite surprising happening in the Oval Office, Senator Scott recounted. He said, "We are not on the same page on the history of race relations in this country. Help me find the way forward." So, I started talking about legislative remedies that would help poor kids from poor communities, like the ones I grew up in, Scott continued. According to Newsmax, Scott credits that conversation with Trump as what eventually led to the bipartisan passage of new legislation. And, he said that he was interested in the legislation. Long story short, he supported the legislation, and now, Cory Booker and myself, Chris Coons, and other Democrats, along with Republicans on the Finance Committee got that bill passed into law, and every state is now looking at ways to create opportunities, Scott explained. Yes, the rhetoric cannot be helpful, it can be indefensible at times, but the challenge I laid on the president's desk was to help me find a path forward, and legislatively you had to concede that that legislation, as well as now record low unemployment in communities of color, are helpful targets from a public policy standpoint, Scott continued. But, we still have to wrestle with the rhetoric that can sometimes be hurtful. Obviously caught off guard by Scott's candid and unexpected story about Trump, Camerota simply said, "I think that's a really valuable story. It's never easy for liberals to give Trump credit for being open-minded or even to admit that he isn't filled with contempt for people of color. Liberals will eventually have to come to terms with the fact that Donald Trump is probably one of the greatest presidents our country has ever had. In all honesty, former President Barack Obama didn't exactly set the bar for performance very high after 8 years of increasing debt and destructive policies across the board. Despite his predecessor having been an absolute failure, Trump is proving himself to be a true leader for all Americans regardless of their ethnicity. Trump's accomplishments in the jobs sector alone prove that he is a far better president than Obama ever was for minorities. Still, these are things that liberals have trouble seeing because they aren't interested in Americans having a higher quality of life. The unfortunate truth is that the left really only thrives when people fail and when they become dependent on the government for sustenance. After decades of that kind of thinking, there are entire cities that have become criminal hotbeds where the majority of minorities live in sub-poverty conditions. I think Chicago is a great example to look at when criticizing liberals for the negative effects of their ideology. I applaud Senator Scott for taking the time to compliment our president for his quality of character and open-mindedness when it comes to bringing different views to the table.